Good afternoon. You are joining the NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation webinar series. Today's webinar is Evolving Approaches to Electricity System Planning, and we will begin in just 1 minute.
Does it go louder?
Oh, thank you. You have a donut.
Good afternoon. You've joined NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation for our new webinar series. Today's webinar is on Evolving Approaches to Electricity System Planning. This is Danielle Sass-Burnett, the Director of the Center for Partnerships and Innovation. Thank you all so much for joining us. Today, if you want to ask a question, we will have opportunities for that. Please plan to use your webinar GoToMeeting control panel to raise your hand or type something into the chat box. We will be monitoring those, and we will either unmute you or articulate your question for you because everybody is on mute. The webinar.
Yes,
For speakers, if you are not currently speaking, it would be great if you could put yourself on mute locally as well. So for today's webinar, our moderator is the Vice Chair of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, Beth Trombold, who is also the Co-Vice Chair of the NARUC NASIO Task Force on Comprehensive Electricity Planning. Commissioner Trombold, thanks for joining us, and please take it away with the webinar introduction.
I don't usually.
Okay, so Commissioner Trombold and Sarah, if you're in the room there, I think you may have had 2 different microphones on at the same time. So we're going to try you one more time. Can we hear you? We don't hear any feedback now.
Hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I think we fixed it. Sarah, thank you. I'm not always good with these technical difficulties, but we got it. So anyway, thanks everyone for tuning in. This is the Evolving Approaches to the Electricity System Planning webinar, and it's the first in a series of webinars, which you'll be hearing more about. And I just want to thank Danielle and our friends at NARUC who continue to work to keep this important system planning conversation at the forefront. I think it's a really valuable and timely webinar, so because each day disruptors are changing the way we use and distribute energy. So utilities and stakeholders are eager to modernize. This is what we've heard during Ohio's Power Forward discussion over the last several years. And for the first time, we're seeing a shift in consumer expectations in which they desire more interaction with their utilities. In fact, just the other day, I saw some commercials about AEP talking about this on TV here in Columbus, Ohio. And that was sort of interesting for me the first time to see them advertising ways in which customers with smart meters can interact with their utilities and understand what usage looks like in their home. So like I said, it's an exciting time in the energy field as new innovations have the potential to enhance customer electricity experience as well as modernize our grid and make it more efficient and reliable. And these are things that we heard a lot of here in Ohio. We also see big changes coming as we as regulators and stakeholders are prepared to help integrate these changes into our existing system. We often hear that the system today wasn't built for the things that we may want it to do. And so we have to kind of look at ways in order to integrate those changes. we see that this is a unique opportunity to lead here in Ohio. And like I said, we heard from many, many industry stakeholders, about 100 participants in our Power Forward discussion, talking about grid modernization and what it means to Ohio. And then just this past August, we finally released our Power Forward roadmap, and the roadmap outlines a vision to allow our state to steer the regulatory community and stakeholders down a grid modernization path that will enhance customer experiences in the end. That's our intent. So webinars like this are timely as they bring to light the groundwork that has been laid to prepare for the grid of the future, as well as the work that's yet to come to continue to innovate and serve customers in a new way. So today we have three really, really good speakers. The first is Lisa Schwartz. She's Deputy Leader of the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Berkeley Lab, and before that she was Director of the Oregon Department of Energy. And at the Oregon Public Utility Commission, she led staff working on resource planning and procurement, demand response, and distributed and renewable energy resources. Welcome, Lisa. Next, we have Natalie Mims-Frick, is an Energy Efficiency Program Manager in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And Natalie conducts research and manages projects on energy efficiency, technical assistance policy, program design, implementation, and evaluation. So welcome, Natalie. And lastly, we have Juan Pablo J.P. Carvalho. He's a Senior Scientific Engineering Associate in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. We have a theme going here, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, I think. His research areas at the labs focus on regional resource planning, regulatory design for planning and investment in electricity markets, and the policy, economic, and financial aspects of the U.S. ESCO industry. So now I will turn it over to our first panelist, Lisa Schwartz. And we'll have each panelist go, and then at the end we'll do some Q&A. Is that all? Anything else I need to tell them, Danielle?
That was perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, so take it away, Lisa.
Thank you, Vice Chair Trumbull. So I'll kick off our presentations today. Next slide, please. I'll first talk about how our own research and technical assistance to states informs the grid planning activities. And well, I'll give you a flavor of the various kinds of grid planning activities that we have. I'll talk specifically about distribution system planning and integration with other processes, particularly in light of distributed resources. And then Natalie will cover in more depth integrated resource planning and distributed resources. And I encourage you to look at the slides in the back of the deck for more information, both technical assistance that's available and publications. Next slide, please. So to put things in a broader context, Berkeley Lab's work in this area began around 1990, and we spent about 5 years training public utility commissions on integrated resource planning concepts and modeling techniques, and nearly every state participated in that. And then restructuring came along, and we were all focused really on just the demand-side management planning piece. But then pretty quickly thereafter, we had a revival in resource planning, and we also had the development of a tremendous amount of regional planning, and JP on our team will talk about that next, including the impacts of distributed resource policies at the state level on transmission needs. We also delved into more issues related to load forecasting and resource planning versus actual utility procurement. JP also will be talking about that. In the last several years, many of you know, we have gotten very deeply into distribution system planning, and from Berkeley Lab's efforts, we're really focused on the regulatory practices, how states are engaging in the process, as well as training and education that we have been doing with NARUC for states around the country. And most recently, we have the new NARUC NASIO task force on comprehensive electricity planning that we're helping to support. Next slide, please. So here are the three flavors at a high level for electric grid planning. We have distribution planning really focused on the local grid, and focused on assessing physical and operational changes that are needed to maintain safety and reliability. We have in vertically integrated states, continuance of integrated resource planning, which is focused on bulk power system needs and meeting future needs at least cost, reasonable cost. Your state will have its own specific language, but we are also being mindful of the public policy objectives that are layered on the reliability requirements. And finally, transmission planning, which is focused on identifying future transmission expansion needs and looking at options for meeting those needs in multiple scenarios. All across these three types of activities, we are increasingly looking at how we can incorporate distributed energy, resources, and grid modernization planning. Next slide, please. So also key to all of these planning activities is demand-side management planning. And here we're looking at energy efficiency, demand response, as well as distributed generation and storage to meet future energy capacity needs all across these types of planning. In our shop, we're increasingly looking at the time-varying value of distributed resources. For example, efficiency, and the same thing goes for locational value, especially as you get down to the distribution level, that locational value matters so much, as well as when these resources are providing grid services. Next slide, please. So distributed resources really cut across all of these levels of planning because they can provide grid services at both the bulk power system level and also grid-related services. And so if we're trying to understand the value that distributed resources may be able to bring, first we need to be able to determine which services can they provide and what's the sort of magnitude of those services. And then we have to be mindful of the different ways that different kinds of distributed resources can be combined, because that really can change their capabilities to provide some of these services. And then establishing the economic value for that service, we have to be mindful of the economic value to the utility system. So I just want to make the point here that distributed resources can decrease or increase the capacity investments that are needed in distribution systems in order to maintain reliability. Under the right conditions, distributed resources may be able to reduce or defer the need for some distribution system investments, particularly for load relief and reliability, by providing power locally, by reducing power needs locally. But in other scenarios, accommodating larger amounts of distributed resources might actually require adding additional technologies to the system, whether it's upgrades of transformers, voltage regulation devices, and protection equipment. Next slide, please. So we're increasingly focused on what we're calling integrated distribution system planning. So this is going beyond the traditional planning, looking just at the physical and operational changes that are needed for safety, for reliability, and affordability. We're also looking toward paying attention to customers' changing expectations and needs and how they're using distributed resources. And we're increasingly paying attention to coordination with other forms of planning, integrated resource planning and transmission planning and DSM planning. And just as important from my perspective is engaging stakeholders to inform multiple scenarios that will enable a robust grid and planning in a changing future. Next slide, please. So this integrated form of distribution planning also is very important to inform grid modernization strategies at the utility level and at the Public Utility Commission level. And we really are looking toward a sort of virtuous cycle where we are looking at some longer term planning on the distribution system, not just the 1 to 3 year planning that sort of you commissions are most familiar with, but really looking at a time frame of say 5 to 10 years. And then that can be fed into a longer term grid modernization strategy and roadmap that is 10 years or even longer, that leads to an implementation plan that again feeds back into subsequent distribution planning, both in the long term and near term. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of drivers here for improving distribution system planning from the perspective of states, and other stakeholders. First and foremost, we're just seeing more distributed resources in some locales, and that's straight up because of cost reductions, but also impacted by state policies, new business models. Utilities are leasing roofs of customers to put solar on. Third-party providers are providing leasing alternatives for distributed resources of various types. And we also see consumer interest in engaging among some consumers. Resilience and reliability are of foremost importance at the national and state and local levels. Aging infrastructure is always something that we've had to address, but we are increasingly seeing many utility proposals for grid investments, and commissions are trying to understand how does this all fit in a longer term plan. In regions with high levels of wind or solar at utility scale, they have a greater need for grid flexibility, and distributed resources of certain types, like demand response, like storage, they really can enable, even though they're connected at the distribution level, they actually can provide that grid flexibility that's needed at the bulk power system level as well. We, for decades, have invested in conservation voltage reduction and optimizing volt and VAR that not only saves energy at the distribution system level, but in customers' homes and businesses, just by the nature of how it works. We're also increasingly looking at alternatives to traditional distribution system investments, non-wireless alternatives like energy efficiency, demand response, distributed generation and storage, in some cases, may provide net benefits to customers. And then finally, but most important perhaps, this is probably worth paying attention to given the magnitude of the expenses. Just in 2017 alone, and just looking at investor-owned utilities, they spent $35.7 billion on distribution. That's 29% of their capital investments, and it's about the same as generation, and it's larger than transmission. Next slide, please. So another benefit of distribution planning is really understanding the broader picture, making transparent a utility's longer-term plans for investments and expenses as well, before just showing up individually in a rate case or if it's allowed in your state in a rider. Providing opportunities up front for meaningful commission and stakeholder engagement can improve outcomes. We also can make sure that uncertainties are considered, so we have a range of possible futures that we look at. We can consider all solutions to try to drive at solutions that are least cost and least risk, and motivate utilities to choose those. And again, enabling consumers and the marketplace to propose grid solutions and participating in providing grid services where appropriate. So this graph shows that, we're still really in stage one, where in most regions of the country, we have low adoption of distributed generation. There are some regions that are beyond stage one, and we don't know that this will be a nice orderly S-curve like you see in the graph. The report that this graph comes from actually talks about the potential for disruptive change, very, very rapid change that might lead states to want to plan better now. Next slide, please. So we are seeing some emerging planning elements. We are getting much better at projecting loads in a very granular way on the distribution system. In the face of distributed resources, using customer adoption models, it's becoming best practice. We're starting to, in several states around the country, analyze the hosting capacity. That is, how much of various types of distributed resources at a specific location can be interconnected without adversely impacting power quality or reliability, and without the need for infrastructure upgrades. This is important because before customers or third-party vendors spend a lot of time and money on interconnection planning and studies, they have a better sense of better places on the grid to locate, and maybe places that might be more costly. States are starting to work with utilities on understanding the locational value of distributed resources, analyzing non-wires alternatives to traditional investments. We're getting much better at seeing visibility into the distribution system at the grid operator level. We're getting better in our modeling and representing the distribution system in a more granular way. And we're going to make some strides on engaging stakeholders as appropriate in the process. Next slide, please. So here are just some examples. I'm sure, there are many states that can and should be added to this slide. Just to give you a flavor, many states now are requiring utilities to file either distribution plans or grid modernization plans or both. Several states are requiring consideration of non-wires alternatives to see where they may be cost effective and save money. There are an increasing number of states that are requiring hosting capacity analysis, and some utilities that are doing it on their own motion and demonstrating it for the rest of us. Several states are paying a lot of attention to the locational benefits of distributed resources because that's what matters, especially for distribution planning. A couple of states are really focused on being more resilient in the face of severe weather events. So they're looking at storm hardening and undergrounding. And many states, for many decades, have had requirements for utilities to come before the commission, either public meeting or through a report or both, to tell them about the circuits that are really not performing as well and how they're going to improve upon that. So here on my last slide, I'm going to give just a quick example here of Minnesota. They recently set integrated distribution planning requirements for their largest utility, Xcel Energy, but they also set requirements for smaller regulated utilities, and I have links to both of those documents here. Most requirements, interestingly, are the same across the utilities, and they spent a lot of time trying to understand, what requirements might need to be different because utilities are not all the same within a state. But in fact, most requirements are the same across utilities. There's a 10-year distribution system modernization and infrastructure investment plan, and within that, a 5-year action plan based on the utility's own internal business plans and being mindful of possible futures with respect to amounts and types of distributed resources, sort of a base case, medium, and high. There's an explicit requirement to coordinate distribution planning with integrated resource planning. There's a stakeholder engagement requirement. I think what's particularly interesting is the specification of the data that must be in these filings. Covers the distribution system and the equipment. It covers spending data on distribution systems and various types of information on the deployment of distributed resources both today and expected for the future. And for all projects that are over $2 million, these are traditional distribution projects. So say a substation upgrade. So for any project over $2 million, utilities need to analyze how non-wires alternatives such as efficiency or storage or a combination, how do they compare? Both in viability, will this really work for the designated issue like load relief? What's the price comparison? And what's the long-term value? And then for smaller utilities, really the key differences here are just instead of filing once a year, they file every 2 years. And they've also got simpler hosting capacity analysis. So I'm going to turn it over next to Natalie, who's going to cover integrated resource planning in more detail.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So my name is Natalie Mims-Frick. I'm a program manager at LB&L, and I'm going to be talking about IRP, as Lisa mentioned. And as you can see on this map, many states do require integrated resource planning. In fact, most of them do. Next slide. And many utilities include distributed energy resources, or DERs, in their integrated resource planning, although the approach for inclusion varies both by resource and by state. I have several examples listed on this slide. I'm not going to read through all of them, but I will highlight Oregon. Oregon electric companies must evaluate DERs on par with supply-side resources and IRPs and consider and quantify where possible additional benefits. The PUC had an order for Portland General Electric's 2016 IRP that required the utility to work with staff and other parties to advance DER forecasting and DER representation in the IRP process. And finally, the staff's 2019 white paper proposes a holistic, robust structure for distribution planning, including planning for DERs. New Orleans and New Mexico require storage to be included in their IRPs. Massachusetts just recently issued an order clarifying the role of DERs in companies' planning and operation processes. And a handful of states require consideration of combined heat and power, or CHP, in IRP. Next slide, please. There's different levels of data resolution that are necessary when considering DERs and electricity planning, and the resolution is going to vary depending on the use of the data. So using efficiency as an example, cost-benefit analysis often uses hourly data, where distribution system planning may require sub-hourly data and location-specific data. And data resolution for resource planning is going to vary depending on how efficiency is being considered in the planning process. And I'll talk about that more on my next slide. So if we can go to that one, please. There's generally two approaches that are used. Can we go to the next slide, please? Sorry.
It's just catching up. We've advanced.
Oh, okay.
But
Well, I will go ahead and talk and hopefully it will pop up. There's generally two approaches that are used for incorporating efficiency into resource planning, and it can be considered as a reduction to load forecast, or it can be used as an optimization, included in an optimization model as a resource. And I'll talk about each one of those approaches as examples in my next slide. So we can actually go to the one that you were on, or the one after this, sorry. I have two examples, yeah, great. So Public Service of New Mexico is my first example, and they use the first approach that I was talking about, which is a reduction to load forecast. And their 2017 IRP is the example that I used, and PNM's existing efficiency and future efficiency are added together and then reduced from the load forecast. For future efficiency, PNM only accounts savings from their current efficiency programs through their estimated lifetime, but then they assume that as the lifetime of the programs expire, the programs are going to be replaced with new programs. So demand savings and energy savings continue throughout the plan period. And that's helpful when you're using this approach because it prevents a steep drop-off of efficiency in the future. PNM estimates their future efficiency levels based on the requirement that they invest 3% of retail sales revenue in efficiency and load management. And the utility likes this approach because they believe it brings consistency in the level of spending and savings that can be expected over time. And as part of their IRP, this table on the right shows high, mid, and low load forecast sensitivities. And the low load forecast sensitivity has the most energy efficiency in it, and the mid case is actually what PNM included in their most cost-effective portfolio, which is comparable to a preferred portfolio for their IRP. We can go on to the next slide. My second example that I wanted to talk about is for PacifiCorp, which is a utility that operates in 6 states. And they use the second approach that I mentioned, which is they allow energy efficiency and demand response to compete with other resources in their capacity expansion model. And how this works is PacifiCorp uses their capacity expansion model to simulate economic dispatch of existing and potential power systems to allow efficiency to compete directly with these other resources. They use reliability criteria and economic decision rules to determine the type, amount, and schedule for new resource development to meet future needs for energy and capacity. And they can also use their capacity expansion model to determine whether retirements of existing resources or power purchase contracts would be economic. And how efficiency is included in the capacity expansion model is various efficiency measures are bundled by price, and then the efficiency shape of each bundle is determined based on the measure mix. Then the efficiency shape is made available to the capacity expansion model to select it based on those different price bins. We can go on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about in my next few slides the results of what efficiency and demand response look like in PacifiCorp's IRP after they use this process. And then I'm also going to touch on private generation or customer-sided generation and how PacifiCorp incorporates that into their IRP after this. So this slide shows us the energy mix for PacifiCorp's 2017 IRP update, and this is system-wide. And as you can see, the orange bar at the top of the stacked bars is energy efficiency. They call it Class 2. And the projected energy mix includes 4 to 13% of energy efficiency annually. And demand response doesn't appear on this chart because this is an energy-only chart. So if we go to the next slide, in order to look at what the actual capacity mix was, I needed to go into one of the PacifiCorp operates as 2 different entities, and we're looking at Rocky Mountain Power, which is the eastern half of PacifiCorp. And this is their 2027 summer capacity mix. And the big blue box is thermal generation. So the majority of their capacity is coming from that. But energy efficiency does have 555 megawatts, or about 6.7% of their summer capacity. And demand response is about 3.9%, or 323 megawatts. We go on to the next slide, we look at their winter capacity. Again, it's similar to the summer, where the majority of the capacity is from thermal generation. Efficiency is providing 363 megawatts, and demand response is not included because they're not operating that during the winter time. So if we go on to the next slide, shifting back to PacifiCorp's system-wide perspective and looking at private generation, the company uses this private generation study that they had done by Navigant to support their IRP and project a level of distributed energy resources that customers might be installing over the next 20 years under a base, low, and high adoption scenario. And PacifiCorp defines private generation as sources that provide customer-sited energy generation and are generally of relatively small size and generate less than the amount of energy used at a particular location. So it's a pretty broad definition. The graph on the slide shows PacifiCorp's low, base, and high adoption scenarios that Navigant developed for them. The base case is 1.4 gigawatts of cumulative private generation capacity. The low case is 1 gigawatt, and the high case is 2.1 gigawatts. And if we go on to the next slide, this is the base case, and so this is, PacifiCorp broke this down by resource. And so you can see that the majority of their anticipated customer adoption is in residential solar, which is the darker orange kind of reddish block, and then non-residential solar makes up the lighter yellow-orange block, and that's what they're anticipating will be showing up in their IRP, or showing up on their system, excuse me. And so the PacifiCorp used this base case private generation adoption scenario in their resource needs assessment, and they reduced their load forecast by this amount of capacity in order to create what their future needs were. And they used their high and low scenarios in a sensitivity analysis, and they looked at 15 different sensitivity analysis in their 2017 IRP to understand how certain modeling assumptions are going to influence the resource mix and timing of future resource additions. So they used all three of these different scenarios as they were going through their IRP. So for my last slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about a forthcoming report that we have. As Lisa, I think, mentioned, we've been working on a report on energy efficiency in resource planning, and we're reviewing a spectrum of modeling techniques that are used to incorporate efficiency into electricity planning, including identifying key planning practices, which are load forecasting, potential assessments, capacity expansion model inputs and modeling, and risk analysis. And we're using a case study approach to discuss how utilities, ISO RTOs, and regional planning agencies treat efficiency in resource planning. And our case studies are going to be on the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, New England ISO and PJM, AEP, and PacifiCorp. And we have some nice coverage across the country. We have some geographic diversity. We have about 30 different states that are going to be covered by those case studies. So my next 3 slides after this are really takeaways for everyone. This is a graph showing how the Pacific Northwest looks at energy efficiency and how a utility in Michigan looks at energy efficiency. And as I was discussing with PNM, they don't have efficiency just drop off, and the shorter blue line shows what your efficiency forecast looks like if you assume that there's no efficiency in the future. So and obviously the Pacific Northwest has a little bit of a different perspective on that. So the next 3 slides after this are resources that are available for you. These are reports and references to a variety of different materials that Lisa and I have both talked about. And then I also just wanted to mention briefly that LBNL does offer technical assistance to states on a variety of different topics, and we've been doing lots of work in Michigan and Minnesota and all over the country. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. I think, Danielle, we're going to do maybe some clarifying questions now.
Thank you so much, Natalie and Lisa. Yes, if anyone has a question or two for Lisa or Natalie before we move on, or I should say while we're switching presenters, please go ahead and raise your hand or type it into the chat box. And in the meantime, we are getting JP loaded up here.
Danielle, this is Beth Trombold. I just have a quick question for you, Natalie. When you had the one slide up and had the boxes of different resources and you had thermal listed there, can you expand on what you mean by thermal? To make sure I understand what that encompasses.
I actually don't know what that is. I
can chime in here. I think.
Thank you.
This is Lisa. It's just thermal plants. So this is just trying to convey instead of a pie chart, it's sort of a square chart. This just conveys the resource mix. There's one slide on the summer capacity mix and one on the winter. And so thermal just means the full range of, fossil fuel plants, gas plants, coal plants.
Okay, that's what we figured, but I just wanted to clarify, make sure that's the way I should interpret it.
And I can give the resource mix to you after I look it up. I just don't remember off the top of my head exactly what the
I just want to make sure I wasn't reading more into it, and then that's what it was, like geothermal or something. So anyhow, okay, thank you.
Great question. And it looks like JP's up and ready to go. Please take it away.
All right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share our work and our research. I'm going to largely talk about the resource planning portal and give some screenshots as examples of how the portal works. And then I'm going to present on two specific projects that draw on data from the portal that we have developed in the past couple of years. I'm trying to advance my slides, but there you go. The Research Planning Portal, or RPP, in this presentation comes out of a LBNL paper developed in 2014 that included a comprehensive review of Western U.S. integrated resource plans that covered about 90% of the sales in the region. The paper is quite comprehensive, covers an evaluation of plant retirements, load DSM and generation mix forecast, risk categories, and assessment techniques. But among them, one of the sections in this paper devotes some space and effort to identify and report on the inconsistencies and lack of clarity in the information that is included and reported in these plans. Among some of the examples that their paper reports are nominal and available capacity not being clearly reported for different technologies. In many cases where fuel, carbon, and capital costs are provided, it's unclear whether it's being provided as in a real dollar or a nominal dollar fashion. And when provided as nominal dollars, sometimes or very often, the assumptions about inflation are not provided or not clear. In many cases, there are use of proprietary forecast data that prevent further examination of some of the values and assumptions. And in other cases, especially in smaller load-serving entities or LLCs, there is an absence of DSM data provided. So as an outcome of this work, DOE decided to fund the Resource Planning Portal, a free web-based tool that allows users to input long-term electric utility planning information in a consistent, specific format, benchmark planning assumptions across jurisdictions and load-serving entities, and also visualize output results in ways that can lead to useful analysis. I'm going to quickly share a few screenshots of how the portal works. This is a live website that you can go visit anytime and sign up for an account and explore it. The landing page gets you to the entering of a new plan. There's a list of load-serving entities, around 50 of them. If there's a new load-serving entity, you have to reach out to us to enter it. But this allows to enter many plans for a single load-serving entity. The structure of the data provided, as you can see on the left menu, is pretty much follows the standard structure of a resource plan. Load forecasts and energy savings and the demand response reduction are entered and their forecasts. A list of power plants and future or expected plants and contracts are also inputted. We record transmission, distribution, and storage assumptions, and fuel and environmental assumptions as well. This is how the, for example, energy forecast looks like. This is extracting usually the base forecast, but you can also record alternative forecasts if needed. Plan information, usually we record all the entire portfolio of a given load-serving entity, and the system has a very useful feature that allows to copy plans from a previous plan to a new plan that you're entering for a given LLC, so you don't need to repeat all the entering of the information. That means that you enter the portfolio once, and you just keep adjusting as plans are retired or added in the portfolio. There is space, as I mentioned, to enter different types of costs, capital costs that are very useful to recreate potentially capacity expansion models, carbon price assumptions, fuel price assumptions that are very useful. And in fuel price assumptions, we can record base or reference cases as well as low and high estimates. As part of the RPP, we do have a specific section where you can upload the documents. This is especially useful for keeping a record of the actual reports and appendices that are created as part of the resource planning process, and keep them all in a single section. As part of the outcomes of such a thorough and standardized collection of data, it's easy for the system to produce load and resources tables that are usually one of the main outcomes of any integrated resource plan. These tables are automatically created based on the input data on the both demand side and supply side. One interesting thing is that the load and resources table can not only be created for an LLC, but it can also be created for a bundle of load-serving entities, or to produce a regional analysis of load and resources. Another visualization tool are different types of charts. In this particular case, we are showing the mix of technologies, the forecasted mix of technologies for several load-serving entities in the West, adding up to over 200,000 megawatts or 200 gigawatts of capacity. And our resource planning portal also includes a map visualization. In this particular case, we're displaying the percent of capacity that comes from renewable resources. And we can see, I think the scale is missing in this particular screenshot, but there's a scale that shows you can easily visualize from a geographic perspective what percent of capacity comes from renewable resources for different load-serving entities across the West. I wanted to share a few statistics from the current status of the resource planning portal. There are 126 plans uploaded. We have a goal of uploading 150 by around the summertime. The plans cover from as early as 2003 to the most recent 2018 plans. That means that we have, in some cases, several plans available for a given load-serving entity, which allows to produce trends analysis, and some of which I'm going to share shortly. We have been focusing largely in the West. There are about 40 Western load-serving entities in this in the resource planning portal, but there are also we have been expanding toward the Midwest and the East for a few states, as Natalie was showing, that also have resource planning directives. And right now we have 15 of those load-serving entities. The portal holds around a third of the U.S. installed capacity, or around 340 gigawatts, and about a quarter of the U.S. electricity retail sales right now. And we're hoping to increase these numbers as we add more plants. And even if we had not done really a strong marketing around the resource planning portal, we already have 200 registered users that are and most of them visualizing and obtaining data from the portal. One application that I want to share of the resource planning portal, it's a second paper in our series of papers in integrated resource planning that we call the planning to procurement paper. The idea behind this work is that, in principle, IRP should lead to affordable and reliable electricity service through cost-effective and risk-managed resource acquisitions. However, this premise has never been tested, in part because when a lot of the IRP research was being developed in the mid-90s, there were not really a lot of plans to, there was not really a lot of lead time between plans and outcomes to be able to perform this work. So the simple question that simple couple questions this research is asking is, how do plan acquisitions compare to outside procurement? And if they're different, why do they differ? And essentially then some discussions about what is the value of IRP if procurement and planning differ. For this particular work, we chose 12 load-serving entities in the West. And to answer the more detailed questions about why planning and procurement differ, we chose the 3 load-serving entities that you see with a red square there, Avista, Idaho Power, and Sierra Pacific. And we delved into their regulatory dockets and traced about 15 years of filings between resource plans and procurement filings to understand how things evolved and how resource acquisitions were being made. Using data from a resource planning portal, we could compare easily plan and actual data for both contracted and self-built or owned resources. What we found is that there were, in this owned resources, expectations for much more coal to be developed. These are using plans developed in 2003 to 2005. And it turns out that most of that coal was actually not developed and was substituted by natural gas generation in combined cycles. At the same time, there were a fair amount of unknown. I'm looking at the upper left quadrant. There were a fair amount of unknown resources planned. These are, as you know, resources that are not identified in terms of technology, but whose capacity is identified as being needed. And it turns out that most of that was fulfilled with wind capacity in reality. However, what is interesting is that the levels of planned and actual resource acquisition are very similar for both contracts in around 7.5 gigawatts and own generation at around 12.5 gigawatts. But when we open this at the load-serving entity level, and here just shows a random sample of 4 of them, things differ quite dramatically. For example, PacifiCorp acquired much more wind than expected, in part because of RPS requirements that came into play. PGE did was quite consistent in their acquisition compared to what they were planning. For example, Puget Sound was expecting a much larger unknown wedge of capacity that was actually never really acquired. And Seattle was also expecting to acquire larger amounts of renewables that ended not being necessary, most likely due to the recession and the impact that it had on load growth. In explaining these differences, we found 2 general sources that utilities put forth to explain, or that we found that would explain why planning and procurement were different. And we classify them as exogenous or endogenous. Exogenous sources are things that are generally beyond the control of the load-serving entity. One of the main ones that we found was retail choice, and particularly larger customers that can't choose their provider and the supplier. The departure, most of the time unexpected, of the suppliers led to specific strategies being designed to try and either keep that block of load within the service area. And this led to specific procurement strategies designed for just that. We also found that DSM programs perform much better than anticipated, at least in the 3 case studies that we studied. Some endogenous factors are elements that could be perhaps enhanced or influenced by either the utility or the regulator. One element that we found here was the timing of procurement being affected by the results of request for proposal processes. In more than a few cases that we analyzed, we found that requests for proposals were either delayed or were declared with no valid proposals, and that led to uncertainty in the acquisition of these resources and some pressure for owning some resources rather than acquiring them in this way. We also found, as I mentioned before, that changes in different types of policies, among them renewable portfolio standards and demand-side management requirements, explain higher acquisition of renewable resources and the reduced load growth. And in most cases, these changes over time are not usually anticipated by the utility, although they could be traced in a way that could be incorporated more successfully in the planning and then therefore reflected in the procurement outcomes. When analyzing the link between planning and procurement, and mostly the way we did this was analyzing different procurement documents filed as e-dockets, and then trying to, as we read, identify references to the most recent or older resource planning processes, and we find very little to no evidence that any risk analysis information or sensitivity performed in the RFPs that we were studying were used to inform procurement levels or the mix of resources or the buy versus build decisions. So we really, which is one of the important efforts in resource planning, we didn't find evidence that it was influencing procurement decisions. What we did find is that the value of new information is very high. As many of you know, upon the time of procurement, there is a requirement for specific simulations and analysis using the most up-to-date data available. And that means that in general, the plans are not really employed in making these decisions. And as I mentioned, there's very little reference to prior RFPs or updated planning results when looking for procurement approval. Another application of the resource planning portal that we are in the process of producing, we're almost finalizing this paper, is a paper or research where we study trends in short and long-term market purchases by mostly vertically integrated utilities. What I mean by that is that we focus largely in vertically integrated utilities in the West, but we do bring in, as a way of comparison, load-serving entities and data from non-vertically integrated utilities in infrastructure states to have a sense in how their choices in market transactions are shaping over time. The paper studies how market purchases are assessed in IRP, and we perform a quantitative analysis of the trends in their use. What we found were two main points. One is that the sophistication of market assessments varies widely. In the 11 resource plans that we analyze in more depth, from a simple spot price forecast to a much more lengthy regional assessment. And in this case, there are a few load-serving entities that just buy a price forecast for their closest market or hub, and they use that spot price as a definition of what the market would look like and potentially to use to assess market purchases to fulfill their obligations. And in the other extreme, there's a utility like Puget Sound who develops a whole regional assessment capacity expansion model on their own to have a sense on how the market will behave. And this makes sense because Puget Sound is possibly one of the largest IOUs, the IOUs with one of the largest portfolios that's comprised of market transactions. We did also find that 2/3 of the load-serving entities do not include short-term transactions in their portfolios. This is in their preferred portfolios, and half of them do not even include them as possible resources, even though in our analysis we did find quite extensive use of both long and short-term or even real-time market transactions. As an example of the use of the resource planning portal, we can track contracts and market purchases in the portal. And so what we're seeing here for a set of older IRPs and recent IRPs, and the olders being in the 2003 to 2007 period, the recent IRPs in the 2013 to 2017 period, we split in long-term and short-term forecasts, and we estimate the percent or the share of peak demand that is being met by these different types of products. We found that in recent RFPs, there's a much higher, larger use of long-term contracts, especially in the very recent years of the forecast, and going down to about 15 to 20% of the total mix. And we think that the very high, very short-term dependence on long-term are usually PPAs that are signed mostly for renewable energy purposes. We also found that in short term, while in the older RFPs there was a general decrease of their use over time, there were some LLCs declare a higher share of their peak demand being met with short term resources, but then as time went over, they rely much more on own resources to cover those long term needs. Whereas in recent IRPs, we found a very interesting upward trend for larger dependence in short-term transactions. And in this group of Western LLCs, that can be explained perhaps by the energy balance market that many LLCs are joining, and that's enabling them to use cost-effectively market transactions to fulfill their resource planning needs and procurement needs. And in that, there is a mismatch in between what we find with a very simplified and not sophisticated treatment of market transactions and what we're seeing here, which is a trend for higher use, especially in short-term transactions for both responding to load forecast uncertainty and also to integrate renewables and balance them. Future work that we're undergoing in this space, it's coming out of the interviews that we held for our market transactions paper that I just presented, where many of the interviews were commenting on the lack of a regional resource adequacy assessment. And in conversations with the Western Interstate Energy Board, we're partnering with them to analyze what are the necessary fields or data elements that we would need to include in the resource planning portal to be able to run the standard or usual resource adequacy modeling that most LLCs do, but to do this at the regional level rather than the load serving entity service area level. And we're not still thinking on developing the tool itself. We're mostly interested in understanding what types of models are used and how the RPP has to change to include this new data and what data we may be missing. But the one potential use is to develop an online free resource adequacy assessment tool that could be used by different stakeholders to make assessments of resource adequacy in the whole region or portions of the Western US. For more information, you can, in this page, you can find our 3 existing papers and a couple of 2 upcoming papers. One of them, the use of market purchases, as I was describing, and a 5th paper that we're just starting, where we want to assess economic value of integrating distributed energy resources in electric utility resource planning. There is my contact information here. Please feel free to reach out with any questions that may not be answered in the following Q&A. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, JP, for all of that information and very interesting analysis. So we will turn to questions now for remaining 5 minutes. I'm going to bring up the list of future webinars as we do those questions. But first, there was a question that came in that asked who the intended audience is, JP, for the RPP. Could you speak to that for a moment? And then I'll turn it over to Commissioner Trumbull for any questions she might have.
Yes, that's a great question. In our mind, one of the main beneficiaries of the RPP could be public utility commission staff that could benefit from having the data organized in such a way that could ease much more the analysis of the data included in resource plans from the utilities they overview, under their purview. We also believe that stakeholders, particularly the ones involved in public processes and consultations, would benefit of having all the data available, easily accessible to them to perform their own analysis. We believe that these 2 groups are probably the ones that are most affected by the asymmetry of the natural asymmetry of the load-serving entity holding all of the data and the details and having them in a certain format. So I think we believe those are the main 2 groups we're aiming for.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Trumbull, did you have any questions to start?
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, I have a couple. I guess any of the panelists, can you talk a little bit about when it comes to electricity system planning, are there certain aspects we as commissions should be prioritizing over others? I know it's kind of a simplistic question, but it would be helpful just to get your thoughts.
Well, this is Lisa, if you can hear me okay. I mean, you know, I'm going to probably give you an answer that may not be as satisfying. You know, it is tough to sort of say, you know, we should emphasize one or the other, but I think we're talking about an integrated model where, you know, if you have integrated resource planning, you know, you can sort of amend it like Washington State is, like Nevada has done, where you're taking into account distributed energy resources more clearly, and you're taking into account your distribution system planning. You know, for restructured states, you know, where distribution system planning is, you know, certainly already an area of emphasis, and you don't, you know, you're not doing the bulk system planning. I think, you know, thinking about the interrelationships with transmission planning are really useful. I don't, you know, these are all such critical components of our system, and as I showed, the costs that utilities are spending on the various aspects of the grid, you know, distribution system planning is well worth your while, you know, but obviously you've got to continue with the important transmission planning and resource planning as well, and make sure your demand side management planning is helping you out.
I could add that there's been a trend in our analysis of 15 years of resource planning work, a trend of significantly complexifying the processes and the models involved. And especially now, given what Lisa says, that we have to start integrating very different types of systems, maybe a very intentional review of the level of complexity required or how the level of complexity has to connect with the outcomes that we're expecting out of these processes is important, because it's very easy to make these models and processes extremely complicated, especially given the distribution level data that's very granular. So I would encourage to think hard about what is the level of complexity needed of these models, and where to put the complexity and the effort, and where to simplify models and processes.
Okay. And just one other question. So Ohio is a choice state. We're restructured state. And I guess I was just kind of curious, when it comes to electric system planning, what considerations need to be made for vertically integrated states versus restructured states? I know you kind of touched a little bit on this. A few of you may have, but if you could maybe summarize some of that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, I mean, you know, we've got to, for restructured states, you've got centrally organized wholesale markets. And so the interaction with those markets is really key. I think, you know, some of the bulk system values that distributed resources bring, I think they can still be considered in restructured states, because we still, you know, when we're thinking about electricity systems and the consumer level perspective, I think, you know, we still want to be mindful of the benefits that those distributed resources bring all through the chain.
Okay. Anyone else have any comment on that? Okay, Danielle, do we have any more questions come in? Hello?
Hi, this is Kira subbing in for Danielle. I think we did have a question from Karen. Karen, we've unmuted you. Can you try asking your question?
Hi.
Sorry about that.
Karen, I think you have your.
Okay. Well, we have the question here. It's can we get more information on the resource adequacy tool that you're planning to develop?
Yes.
Would this be within the RPP?
Absolutely. There's nothing yet in the RPP on that tool. It is a very preliminary work, but I will be really interested in talking with you, Karen. You can reach out at my email. That's in the last slide in my presentation, and I'm happy to take it from there and explain what we're planning to do and how we're eager to integrate some of the opinions of folks that may be using the system in the future.
All right, thank you. And we have one more quick question. In the Minnesota system planning changes referenced early on, they're providing guidance to utilities to include energy efficiency as a decision criteria in the transmission and distribution planning process. explicit energy efficiency guidance in T&D planning generally appears to be missing. Is there a need for energy efficiency in this process?
Well, this is Lisa. Of course, I'm going to say yes. Energy efficiency is actually often the least cost resource, not just at the bulk power system level, but for certain applications like load relief can be the least cost option for certain distribution system needs. And, you know, the well-known Brooklyn Queens non-wires alternatives project, you know, energy efficiency actually was the leading resource that helped Con Ed save money by deferring a needed investment. So certainly, I think commissions, we're seeing this trend where commissions are explicitly stating energy efficiency is among the options, both resource planning and transmission and distribution system planning. It does help to make it explicit because the definitions of these terms do matter.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And with that, I know we're a little bit over time, so I want to wrap up, but I wanted to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. This is the first in our NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation series. And so this slide shows the remaining topics. We'll be doing these on the second Thursday of every month from 3 to 4. And all the information and registration is available at our website, naruc.org/CPI. And we'll also be posting the slides and the recording of today's webinar on that page as well. So thank you very much, everyone. We hope to see you next month for stakeholder involvement in integrated distribution planning. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.